Stumble forward, stumble forward. The 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 stumble.
I'd like to welcome the great Bill Richardson to the Stumble Forward. Bill is a best-selling writer, legendary CBC radio host, and playwright. He won the Stephen Leacock Award for Humour in 1994. I fell in love with Bill's 2-hour afternoon show on CBC Radio 1 called Richardson's Roundup, which ran from 1997 to 2004. It was a blissfully artful wander through kooky Canadiana and the drifting ephemera of gathered rural tales presented with tenderness, love, and an authentic curiosity. Welcome, Bill Richardson.
Hi, Hawksley. Thank you very much for having me on. I'm so honored that you would remember.
I honestly, Bill, I feel blessed that you'd agree to do this. And how could I forget? I mean, honestly, I sit here feeling, and I don't reckon with imposter syndrome very much, but I do feel like I've got no right really to be talking to you. Going back to those years, you know, I'm a high school dropout, and I feel like that era of the CBC in my early 20s, it carried me through and allowed me an opportunity to feel like I could intellectually punch above my weight if all I did was dedicate myself to the wonders that were the daily imaginings that went on CBC Radio 1 when I was in my 20s, poor, desperate, living, you know, in a crummy place with no bathroom and imagining myself as a great artist. But listening to you on that show was a daily wonder. 2 hours of, I know it was gathered stories and, you know, there was kind of knickknacks from here and there, but you were the central feature of that show. And I hope you don't mind me going back this far in your career to discuss this one thing in particular, because it had an incredible effect on me. I'd also just preface before we get chatting, and then you can sort of take over the most of the exchange. I had once been brought in to guest host Richardson's Roundup, which I think I sent you a message about one time. You were in the building at CBC. I don't know why you weren't able to do the show that day, or if it was just a day off for you. But the producer said, "Oh, would you like to meet Bill? He's in the building, and I'm sure it would be great." And I thought, I absolutely don't want to meet Bill Richardson because, the shoes are so big, it's ridiculous that I'm even here. It's crazy that the CBC put me on an airplane to guest host a show I have no... I don't belong here. And anyways, I feel the same way all these years later talking to you now, because even in trying to research a little bit of your life in order to have an astute chit-chat about it, there's just a lot of years and a lot of left turns in your career as well. So let's start there. I'm hoping in some ways in the next hour or 45 minutes to an hour, we can talk about humor and why it's important and what it is about humor that's fascinating and exciting. Opera.
Sure.
And maybe a little bit of talk about those years at the CBC, because for old CBC, like mythologizers like me, it's an era that I fondly remember. I would wake up early in the morning, turn on the CBC, and live with it all day. So let's start.
Do you still do that?
I don't do that now. No. No, I don't do that now. But I also have a busier life. But
understood. Yeah, I'm the same, and it's not because I don't like what I hear on it, but life has just changed somehow, and also listening habits change. I mean, what you do, for instance, the whole podcast universe has really changed the way people listen to the radio. I used to have some shows, and they would, for the most part, be CBC shows that I would think of as destination listening, and I'd make a point of being there at 5 p.m. of a Sunday afternoon to hear what Eleanor Wachtel had to say.
Exactly.
But once those things were just available to visit any old time, and I finally cottoned on to how that worked, then that stopped being so. I hold on to some of those habits, so I do put it on still first thing in the morning, and in a very old-fashioned way, which is to say, it's the radio, the little portable radio on the kitchen counter, and it's actually a big part of my day is listening to that. But I think that's becoming less and less so, and that's just as it is. It's not a judgment call or anything. But and I first heard of you. Well, of course, back then, and around, I must have been around about 1999 that your career started going, right? I mean, at least in a bigger kind of way, yeah. And I heard of you. I remember vividly because my two colleagues, Andrea Hunter and Anna Bonakoski, who were often on air on the Roundup. We call them the A team for self-evident reasons. And I think Andrea especially was a huge fan of yours. And so she brought word of you to the show, and then we all became fans. And, you know, I got to say, I don't remember that you guest hosted, but I've forgotten a lot of stuff. It's well, no, but I have. I was I was writing about this the other day because the only place I write now is on that blogging platform called Substack. Mm. And I posted something and it had to do with the Roundup, and because it was Labor Day, and when the Roundup, the first show was, it must have been September the 3rd, September the 1st. It was September the 1st, 1997. And the reason I remember this is because on August the 30th, 1997, that was when Diana and Dodie and their driver, Henri Paul, passed under the sand in the tunnel, followed by the paparazzi, and we all know what happened. And so we were all excited. And when I say we all, I think there were just 3 of us working on the show. And that show never had a huge crew. So there was a guy called Todd Elvidge, who very well known as a comedy producer and was Randy Bachman's producer for many years, and Heather Kennedy. Anyway, so we all had we had the show ready to go, and then Princess Diana and everybody else died, and the whole thing had to be changed. And anyway, I wrote about this, and it had to happen. It was a big news event. You had to pay attention to it, even though we weren't really a news program. But you had to be tonally quite respectful and careful. Anyway, I posted this up, and I heard back from somebody who said, I remember that show, and I remember what you said. And you got to be kidding. I have absolutely no recollection. I can't remember anything at all about it. So much of it, all that water is passed under the bridge. So it's fascinating. You just never know was the point of it, I guess, right? You put something out there, you just do what you're doing, and it hits or misses. And there's absolutely no understanding or calculating or predicting how anybody's going to respond to anything at any time. And it's fascinating to me, and it touches me. I have to say, it touches me that show meant something to you. It meant a lot to me, of course, because I was in the thick of it, and it was my job. It was my life for all those years. But as noted, it's mostly gone from me now. I couldn't answer too many specific questions about it, I don't suppose. Anyway, thank you.
You did recount a few things with an almost photographic, sensitivity. Some of those details, Dodie Al-Fayed, including the drivers or the security guard's name. But yeah, I mean, it is amazing what does stick in our memory and what doesn't. And I mean, a long career, an artistic career, is about investing in the moments as they happen, which, I always look at sports as a performer in general. Like I feel, and you were a performer on the radio, in my opinion, like you're living very, very absolutely in those moments. And I find for people who do that on the regular, their ability to categorize memory changes because they do spend a certain amount of time not in the past or in the future. They spend that wonderfully, most absolutely in the moment, which is what great performers, they all do. So, I mean, memories are funny because so much of my career I don't remember as well, except for the high water marks or whatever, because you are so invested in that moment that I think in an artistic career as well, it's usually pursued by somebody who is largely dissatisfied with everything. And that dissatisfaction means that you're pursuing something with more zeal the next day, in my opinion. But okay, so let's talk about this show for a second. And even hearing you talk right now, I mean, you've already said a million things I'd like to discuss, including just the fact that the destination aspect to 20th century arts and culture, that we spent time all tuning in together, the world over, or the country over, into times that created a collective experience. You know, if we all were listening to Bill Richardson's Roundup together, we were having that collective experience. It's something that I absolutely loved about the CBC, and in some ways what helped me mythologize the CBC, and it's why I became a devotee, is that I really felt that this artful thing that was available to me on the radio at any given moment was something that the whole country was collectively tuning into, and we were having that experience in that old 20th century way. That, you know, when I had a Joe job in the basement of an office building in Toronto during the Seinfeld years, and I started to hear how everybody collectively started to sound like the Seinfeld show. Their language, the syntax, everything was changing. And to me, that's what was exciting about the 20th century version of that collective experience. Now that everything is a la carte, everybody is on their own, it's fractured, we're out having our own lives, untethered by having to show up all together to listen to Richardson's Roundup between 2 and 4. I think something is lost. But, you know, I don't know if you know the joke, Bill, and I've told it several times on my podcast, that how many folk singers does it take to screw in a light bulb? 1 to screw in the light bulb, and 3 to sing in harmony about how they like the old one better. That is fundamentally who I am. And I look at what felt sophisticated to me about the old version of arts and culture. And it's also a time that I invested in. I'm getting old too. I'm 48. And, you know, I was a young person who moved to Toronto to, quote unquote, change the world. It's not my world to change anymore. It's just my world to observe. But I can't help, you know, I straddle a funny sort of pre-internet, post-internet, 20th century, 21st century sort of. My life it contains almost equal parts of both. And quite honestly, I'm more comfortable with the early version of my life, and this sort of highly technological fractured version is something I don't completely understand. I'm talking too much. You were making art every day on this show. And to me, I knew that I was listening to an extremely smart person. The thing is that even though this was a intellectually lofty, artful, it almost had a twinkle of wonder, 2 hours of twinkle every day in the week. But you had that authentic care and love of the people who were calling in. And I think that the vastness and dynamism in the Canadian spirit really met its match on your show. Like, you represented it all. And it was always with grace and a full acceptance of what was being said. How many truckers were calling in? How many farmers? It was a version of Canada that goes back to what I was taught when I was in grade school, that we were a country of, you know, fisher people and farmers. You know, it's like, I'm moving too much into this. Bill, you take over. What do you think?
No. I mean, everything you're saying makes some sense to me. And I remember that about it. I remember that, so with that show, the mandate of the show was to be a kind of blue box. It was a recycling show. Mm-hmm. That was what we were assigned to do. And so what had been on air before was Vicky Gabbro's show, where I'd happily worked for about 5 years, which was a wonderful show. Mm-hmm. And I think what they observed was that at that particular time in the afternoon, it doesn't matter that particular time being between 2 and 4.
Yeah.
And again, we're talking 20, more almost 30 years ago now. At that particular time in the afternoon, there's a bit of a ratings trough. I don't even know if they still measure ratings. I have no idea. I've no longer any connection to the CBC, for not for reasons of bitterness. As time has gone on, and I no longer work there. but and I think that at some level of administration, they made a decision that there was no point in having a high-profile host and a big budget and lots of crews and booking in all kinds of guests. So they should just, well, I don't want to say they should just fill the time, but I think they were looking for something that was a little on the lower budget end of things to just slot in when there weren't, in fact, that many people available to listen to the radio, or who, for whatever reason, weren't choosing to. I mean, it is, after all, between 2 and 4 of an afternoon. And this was before you could, before podcasts, before you could go back and listen to it. It was in the moment. It was only in the moment. So the assignment was to cull stuff from other CBC programs and to package it up and to give things a second or third play. And this meant a lot of resistance from listeners. And I understood why. I don't like it now when I turn on the radio and I hear on Monday something I heard on Saturday.
Yep.
But I also understand the reasons for it.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, we decided to try and make something a little bit more than that. And the first inroad to that was this toll-free line that people could call to tell their stories. And it just happened that the number we were assigned by whatever agency it is that assigns toll-free numbers happened to spell out sad goat. I mean, it spelled out other things as well, rad nat or something, but there was just something about this idea, sad goat. It's 1-888 sad goat. That was the number. And so that was how I started giving the number out. Call 1-888 sad goat and tell stories about a time you got stuck or whatever it happened to have been. And slowly over time, people began to do it. And then it began to build. And I remember, this is getting back to what you were saying, the first time somebody called in from a combine and placed a call and left a song request. And it was so astonishing to me that A, you could call from a combine. I had no idea. And B, that somebody would take the time to do this. And it really did give me a sense of something that was going on elsewhere in the country. And again, I hasten to add, I don't say this critically, but I do observe that on the CBC now, with the occasional exception of the show that used to be called The Farm Show, the one that runs between noon and 1, it is a relentlessly urban experience. And increasingly, not necessarily a Canadian experience. On the programs whose remit is to talk about culture, for instance, I mean, yeah, there's Canadian stuff there, but it's quite international in its scope, and well, that's all to the good in its own way. But what is missing now, this is just an old white man talking, but I do kind of hanker for those days when you could turn on the CBC and you might hear a couple of women in a couple of different rural communities talking about their recipes for mustard relish. Now, I mean, this used to be quite run-of-the-mill, and there was something about it that was just incredibly dear. And again, I hear myself saying that, and I think, oh, that sounds condescending, and I don't mean it to be. I mean, I was genuinely interested in it, and in these voices. So it made me happy when I understood that the Roundup was going to be that kind of forum, that it was going to be a place where rural voices as well as urban voices could be heard. And it did give a sense of the country. On the other hand, I would hasten to say, and I was aware of this from the get-go, and I did what I could to counteract it. And this is something I think the CBC does really well now. It was a pretty white bread show. And maybe not surprisingly, I think that the people who were engaged in listening to a radio show between 2 and 4 of an afternoon weekdays were then, at that time, in this country, in the main, people who looked a lot like me. And I was very aware, as were my colleagues, we talked about this a lot, that the demographic that we were presenting on the radio wasn't necessarily the demographic that we saw on the street when we walked outside into urban Vancouver and looked around. I think, where were those voices? And so that's something that is now an everyday reality on the radio. Wasn't then. So when you say it represented the country, in a way, but not widely, not as widely as would have been ideal. But none of these things happen overnight.
Yeah.
And when if you are aware of the gap, if you are aware of this lacune, then it's your job to fill it. But that's not the work of turning a switch. That's the work of a slow build. And so we began it then, and So
I think that's what I meant. Like it presented a rural urban version of Canada that made sense to me as a kid who grew up rurally and then moved to a city. It was representative of that experience. But yes, and I hear everything you're saying about the times and how they've changed, and I agree with everything you're saying, which doesn't really undermine what a gift you have and had back then. We can evaluate our sort of creative lives through new discovery and what we there's a new lens we look through in the 21st century, and there's a lot of ways that we can look back and rightfully be critical. But you as a brilliant creator, to me, that's the part that's somewhat untouchable. I even feel like when you went on to Bunny Watson, I'm guessing you really, it's almost like your solo career. Like you went and did exactly the art you wanted to make. Like if this was sort of like, if Roundup was a sort of a repackaging of stuff, which it never sounded like that to me. I mean, I know the CBC's repackaged I know that template as a longtime fan. I know when I'm listening to a show that they're repackaging stuff, and sometimes I get frustrated with that. That never felt like that with the Roundup. It felt like it always felt brand new and exciting and something I wanted to be invested in. And that, again, I think you were largely responsible for.
Well, as the show went on, it became less and less that. I mean, this was what we were assigned to do at the beginning.
Yeah, right.
And we simply found a way to make it more than that. And there was never a complaint about that from administration, at least not one that I heard. I mean, there may well have been, but
so
yeah, you know, I mean, one of the things about that show, this is when you were talking about recall and about how I was able to pull Henri Paul out of the air, who was the driver. Well, he was the head of security at the Ritz Hotel in Paris, and he was the one who was driving the limousine that Dodi Al-Fayed and the Princess of Wales were in when it was the whole paparazzi thing. We know the story. The only reason I remember that is because, and this, I will tie this into the Roundup. I for the last couple of years, I've been doing a lot of reading of and about and writing about the Canadian writer Mavis Gallant. And this all began because last year was her centennial year. She was born in 1922. And I was concerned that there wasn't a lot of fuss being made about it. And so I decided to make just the smallest fuss the biggest fuss that I could make, which is a small fuss in the universal scheme of things. And I began to write about her in a kind of journal that I published on Substack. This put me in touch with some other people who are interested in her, some black belt wearing academics who have written about her professionally. And with two of these people, a woman named Marta Dvorak and a guy called Neil Besner, I'm working on a collection of her the columns, the features that she wrote for the Montreal Standard between 1944 and 1950. The Montreal Standard is long out of print. It was a weekly paper, like an illustrated news of the world sort of paper. It evolved into weekend magazines, so it was very much like the Star Weekly, if these names mean anything to anybody. The point of it all being that my job is to annotate these columns. And so I'm looking into the photographers she worked with, one of whom was named Henri Paul. And he was a French photographer he born in Paris, around about 1940, his name starts turning up in Montreal with photo credits, and he died in the early 70s. And he was especially well known for his pictures of the artistic community in Montreal, especially le théâtre du Nouveau Monde. So I don't speak French anymore. It comes slowly. Anyway, it was just at this. It happened to be that I was writing about that Henri Beau as Labor Day was coming up. And it happened to be that in researching him, the other Henri Beau, the one who was driving the car, turned up. So it was just a funny little coincidence. And it happened to be that it just happened to be that Labor Day tied into this thing in my own small life. My point is that sort of, I don't know what you want to call it. It's really nothing. It means nothing. But when those funny little coincidences come along, those instances of synchronicity, kismet, whatever you want to call it, I always take it as a kind of blessing conferred. I always think, oh, right, this is a sign that things are as they should be, which of course it's not. But it pleases me to think so, and it. What that is more than anything else is a kind of active listening. And that was what was mostly operative in the Roundup. That a call would come in and you would hear in the call something that you understood could be expanded into something else. It might not be the main meat of the call. It might be some sidelight, but if you just had to listen and you had to wait for it to come. The other thing about that show, and maybe this is the last thing that's really worthwhile saying about it as far as I'm concerned, but it became a kind of act of faith. The reason I left it, the reason I wanted to leave the show and move on to doing something else was that I just felt like I under my stewardship, it wasn't ever really going to change. It was always going to be pretty much as it was. And it felt like it was getting to a point where it needed that. It needed a fresh mind, a new hand, and so Tetsuro Shigematsu was hired to host the show and did so, I mean, wonderfully for a couple of years. And that's when I moved to doing Bunny Watson. But it was what the act of faith was that you would think, okay, this morning is going to be the day that I'll go to work, and on the toll-free line, nobody will have phoned in. There won't be any stories, but there always were. And the great lesson to me is that when it comes to narrative, that's a well that never runs dry. It's always there. There are always stories to tell. And I when I feel a little on the dispirited side now, I still think of that. I still go back to that, and it's become a bit of an ideological touchstone for me, I think.
I feel like I could detect all of that even as a young person, but hearing you say it out loud now and crystallizing it in the way you just did, it also, I mean, it's evidence of somebody whose inner workings are very complicated, and again, I think we gravitate ultimately to those artists who are most in touch with their responsibility. And I feel like what you've just outlined was the conviction to regard that responsibility with seriousness. And again, as a listener, that's what I felt. And I could hear you listening. And as somebody who's interested in discourse and interested in discussion, the listening part is often missing in a lot of interview format stuff. People have a preordained, they already know what they're going to ask, and they're already looking for the standard answers that are coming because you're selling a book or you're selling a movie, you're selling something, and we know we're just going to do this dance that has been done 1,000 times. But I never felt that. I could feel you leaning into the faith on that show. And we will leave it there for Roundup, because there's other things I would like to discuss with you, because when does somebody like me get to hang out with some erudite character like you who could help me understand the things that I don't otherwise understand?
I got to say, hearing you talk about yourself and saying you're old at 48, I absolutely understand that, because I remember the same thing. But believe me, you're not. And I hope you understand that you're living in your best years. The 40s, man.
Yeah,
the 40s are the best. They're totally the best.
I get it, Bill. You know, I come from an unruly, aesthetically built rock and roll world where, being young and beautiful is elementary, and once you sort of stop being young and beautiful, people stop being interested in what you're doing, and then you have to sort of be other things. But I do get it. It's more, I feel like it's just a bit of trauma suffered from years of trying to be pretty so I could be on TV. But I get it. No, I know that I do feel that as well, being in my 40s. I feel like it's been a wonderful time of spiritual growth combined with experience. And probably one of the big reasons I'm not listening to the radio as much as I used to is that I just feel the passage of time has hastened me to my work life in a way that now I need to continue to make stuff. I need to be invested in what I do. And I can't just I can't be a passive member of this. What it is I think if you wake up some days as an artist and you are taking in more than you are creating, which is very easy to do in the 21st century. It's in fact, I think that's the pitfall we're all battling against.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, look, Bill, there's a zillion things I wanted to ask you about, including your writing practice, because again, any great artist, and you've already spoken of faith, and this is interesting to me because this podcast, I wanted it to have sort of a light spirituality aspect. I also really thought in the beginning it was going to be a podcast about humor and comedians, and do all comedians want to be musicians, and do all musicians want to be comedians? It's more broad than that, and it allows me to chat to people who I think are fascinating. And but let's talk about humor, because in my household, humor was a big deal. And when I was a teenager, I wanted to be Bruce Cockburn. And he wasn't funny at all. I mean, he was funny, but he was more a didactic, social justice, travelogue type character. And he still is my favorite songwriter of all time. And arguably, I would trade myself in to be him. But there was
Are you guys friends?
We're the kind of friends you can be when you're friends with your hero. Like, I'm still an idiot when I talk to Bruce. But yes, I've hung out with him many times, and I've never said anything that doesn't sound fanboyish or ridiculous. But with that said, when I wrote my first song that was absurd and a bit humorous, it was the first time I wasn't trying to be Bruce Cockburn. I wasn't trying to write a song about and the environment or whatever it was in high school that fascinated me about me. I wanted to be that big-brained Bruce Cockburn. And then I was like, oh shit, I'm just a guy who likes absurdity and funny things. And then when I marinate in that and allow that to be the voice that comes through, voila, that sounds like me in recordings. And I remember talking to Bruce about this, saying like, here's the thing is that I tried to be you for years in high school. And then when I realized that my lens on the world is more a lens through humor and absurdity, which is what I grew up with. My dad was a working class fellow, worked for Bell Canada, and he would come home from work. Oh, somebody started at work. They're great. They're funny. And, my dad celebrated funny people. And in our house, we celebrated funniness. We didn't celebrate righteousness or piety or anything like that. We like funny people. And when I talked to Bruce about that, he's like, yeah, well, my dad was a pretty sober doctor, and there was no celebration of humor in the household. It's clear why we're two different people. But in the 21st century, as a musician, like, I used to think music was this sacred thing that couldn't be messed with. But, voila, the computer can do all kinds of crazy things, and it can turn people who have a mild, density of talent into sounding like somebody that really belongs on the world stage. Enter humor. Humor can't be lip synced, and it can't be messed with. It either works or it doesn't work. And it's a beautifully meritocratic universe. And it's in some ways why I feel like I'm drawn to funny people and funny stuff, is that this shit just can't be faked. So what is it? You're a funny person. What is it in humor? And are you following me on this whole can't be fake?
Yeah, no. Everything you're saying makes perfect sense to me. Where I fall down on this is that I'm the least analytical person in the world. Well, about most things, but most especially about humor. And not to be disingenuous, of course I understand that what I've done as a writer, and it's I'm very much a player of the minor chord in this line of work. But what I've done as a writer skews to the light. I know that it does. I can't help that. That's just the way it is. I always I just go back to this time and time and time again if I talk about it, which is that English writer and critic Max Beerbohm said something like, it's many charming talents. I think that's what he said. Many charming talents have been ruined by the compulsion to believe that what you should do is carry a heavy weight on your back or to drag a heavy weight behind you. The important thing to know is that if it's your particular gift, just to be able to juggle 3 golden balls. And I'm definitely the 3 golden balls kind of person. I will never deal in any substantial way with the weighty issues that have preoccupied writers from the beginning of time. It's just not who I am. Now, I guess that's a kind of humor, but it's not me trying to be funny. It's just me being true to the voice I am. It's not even that active. It's not even being true. I can't do anything else. I'd love to be able to write.
So maybe this is what I'm getting at. Like what you're saying is that this thing is inextricably sewn into your character. You can't judge the mechanics of it because it's you effortlessly being you, which is again this in some ways more than supports what it is I've said. Like if what I'm talking about, the dynamism of comedy is that it has to come from a body that is so wholly unaware and so prone to wanting to exist within the context of this modality that it's free because it doesn't self-examine. I know I'm trying to be circuitous or wordy or pedantic for the hell of it, but I'm listening to you and I'm thinking you're trying to disprove what I say, but I think what you've done in some ways is that by you being you. So let's talk about funny people. Like you were born this way. This isn't something you've nurtured. It wasn't, oh boy, I'm
Lady Gaga of you, Hawksley. It's true. I was born this way. Yeah, you know, I'm just thinking, I'm not, I don't hang out a lot, right? I don't have a wide social circle and I don't really know a lot of writers. I certainly don't know a lot of comedians. And some of the times when I've been the least comfortable, are times when I've been in, say, agree. It has happened to me, I should say, that from time to occasional time, and this mercifully doesn't happen anymore. I've been invited to take part in things like comedy festivals, and because I have a hard time saying no, witness my presence here this morning.
Thank God you have a hard time saying no.
So I'll find myself in, say, a green room with a bunch of comics, people who are professionally funny, the stand-up types, the debaters types.
Sure.
And I've never felt more like a fish out of water. I don't get them at all. It's not that I dislike them, but there's a kind of that particular clubbishness is just not one that I share, and I don't know why that is. It's not an energy that I get. Well, so go ahead.
Sir, I was just going to say, I mean, you were a writer, and it's a performative act that they're engaging in, and in many
they're writing as well. They're writing those jokes.
They are writing, and of course, and it's obviously it's central to the job, but it's writing with a mind to even building the syntax, and it's a performative art. Your comedy is it's written, and maybe again, like, this is why I feel sort of outclassed and somewhat. I don't even. No, it's just true, Bill. Like, because I've been thinking about talking to you for a couple of days, and I mean, this is a big thing that you're saying. I don't know. I know comedians. I don't know comedy writers. I knew Stuart McLean a little bit. I know that he was fascinated by the story, by the narrative, that thing that's out there, never ending, ongoing. It was a wonder even to watch him we'd be in the back of his tour bus telling stories. And if anything came up that sounded remotely like he could fish in there for something, his ears and again, my wife accuses me of stealing all her cleverest stuff and putting it in lyrics in my song. So I do get it. We are, we're like hounds out there with our noses to the ground for this.
Yes. Yeah. Did you go with Stewart a lot?
I'm sorry. Oh, I went it with him for one Christmas tour, and it was a wonder to be close to him, and to see, quote unquote, the real Stuart McLean behind closed doors. It was a fascinating, acerbic, dark kind of character. I loved him.
I have often thought that somebody, and maybe this is happening, but somebody really needs to write the Stuart McLean biography, because I knew him just a little bit, and I wrote about him once for, it must have been Reader's Digest. I can't really remember, but I think, and so I went on the bus with Stuart and whoever the guests were, and his usual Jazz and
Yep.
the band of Merry Followers. But no, he was fascinating. He was a very multi-layered person, and I've always thought about Stuart. Yeah, those stories are so inseparable from his delivery, right? I mean, that Vinyl Cafe sort of down-home Jimmy Stewart thing that he did. But he was a really good writer. And when you look back at some of the earlier books, what's it called? I'm forgetting the name of the book now. It was his book about small towns, visiting small towns. He went to like Foxmore in Manitoba, which is not so far from where I'm living now, and other places, just the beauty of the writing, the quality, and in the Vinyl Cafe stories as well. Just to read them is a pleasure for the writing itself. Stuart, he's an interesting guy. Somebody needs to write about him.
What was it back in those days? Like, again, I think back, my mom had a hair salon in our house when we were kids. And
oh, no way.
And my grandma had a hair salon in her house. So I come from a long line of like women with cash businesses in their homes. So we were sort of, my brother and I were subject to the comings and goings of the folks who would, mostly older women getting their hair done, and the discussions that you can kind of overhear when you're a kid who has a hair salon in their house. And there was a retired CBC couple who lived on the lake where we lived, and they were regulars to my mom's shop. Patricia Lambert and I can't remember her husband's name, but they were both old CBC folks, behind the scenes people who would regularly regale us with stories about, she would do makeup on Glenn Gould, and I can't remember if he was a camera operator or sort of an on-set guy, but there was this sense, even before I was a CBC devotee as a kid, as a teenager, as a kid, that like there was something about the CBC as an entity that had an almost magnetic attraction to highly intelligent, highly sophisticated people. Like it almost felt like somebody like you would get born, and then a guy like Bill Richardson, it's not a circuitous path to the CBC. It's like, it's almost a foregone conclusion. Am I right? And again, this goes back a long time. What was drawing people like you, Stuart, those characters who, that mythological era, at least for me, of that CBC thing? What was the magnetic pull to the CBC? You said already, I don't like being in rooms with this type of person, but the CBC was a playground for you, wasn't it?
Well, yes and no.
I may be trying to be. I'm trying to be.
No. I mean, but no. This interests me. I mean, well, first of all, to the hair salon thing. And I'll come back to your question. I just think, what a gift. Yeah. I mean, to have had all of that commerce through the house, and to be able to just listen to, I'm supposing mostly your mother's clients are women. Was that so? I mean, just to be able to hear those women talking would have been so great. Yeah. The stories and the cadences. And I, until a couple of years ago, I owned a house in a little village. I'm in a village now called Crystal City, which is in the rural municipality of Louise, Pilot Mound, Crystal City, Clearwater, the vibrant Tri-City area of the Pembina Valley. Anyway, but I had a house about 40 miles west of here in a village called Homefield. Population then was about 14, probably still is about 14, 1-4. And the house that I had used to be the hotel. And the guy who owned the place before me was named, well, two owners before, was called Jack Kerr. And Jack was a hairdresser. And his salon was in the house. And the week wouldn't go by when somebody wouldn't be just sort of driving through the village on one of those, let's have a look through the village, and stop and say, I used to get my hair done here. I used to get my hair done. And once it was John K. Sampson and his mother.
Oh, wow.
Because they're from Lynette, which is not so far away. So John K's mother used to come and get her hair done in what was my house in Homefield. So no, I just love that. The room that was his salon, I just sort of left empty as a kind of shrine. But I think now, and again, I can't say this for a dead cert, but my sense is that these two things I think are true about the CBC. There isn't nearly as much freelance work, and when I'm talking about radio, not about anything else, not about television, not about the website, just about the radio.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about too. Yes, the radio.
Yeah. So there used to be a lot of freelancers, and that was how I started out. Freelancing for the CBC was a kind of training ground for working there, or it was for some people. It was for me, certainly. I don't hear that anymore. I very rarely hear a freelance voice on the CBC. And the other thing that I think is true is that if you're being hired for a journalistic job at the CBC, then there is, and this is not improper, the expectation that you're going to have some kind of credential, i.e. a journalism degree. Sure. And again, makes sense. But that wasn't so when I was in it. And there was a certain amount of tolerance for, if not direct encouragement of, people who were just not characters. And that had been so from the get-go. And so all of those people who came from, not from journalism, but from something else.
Right.
You know, the Max Fergusons, the Bob Kerrs, the Clyde Gilmores, all of those people who maybe they had newspaper jobs or something else, but they came with a worldview that wasn't shaped by a kind of code of ethics in a way with which might be imbued at a journalism school.
Yes.
When I think of the shit I said on the CV, I mean, I said some really strange, incendiary things, and nobody blinked. You couldn't get away with it now.
I don't really remember the incendiary things. I do remember it. Again, there's only one way for me to. It was artful what you did on the radio, and so I perceived it as an artist making something artful to be taken in that way. I for whatever reason, the particular aerial of reception I used for Roundup was not, oh, this is a news and current events show. This is a show, 2 hours of art, and it's quaint and it's thoughtful and loving, and maybe again because I've seen too, the rural urban divide is it's a very handy political tool. And as a kid who grew up in the rurals with a mom in a hair salon in our basement, who then became famous in France, and I lived in Paris, this whole rural urban divide thing, it never made sense to me because I felt an equal belonging, and I didn't feel like I needed to join one tribe specifically. I grew up alongside rougher characters in the woods, which is how I grew up. People who could fix their own cars and fix their own homes and were very industrious and lived a life that was, I think, rooted in common sense. And city people are educated and intellectual and are worried about other things. And I enjoyed both versions of life and never completely understood why it was that politicians thought that we had such a hate on for one another, because in my opinion, with just a little bit of openness and the kind of openness you had on your show, we could understand that we were all part of a very dynamic, fascinating, and almost humorous fabric here in this country, which was you put forth in an elevated way. That speaks to me. That is loving at a level that makes sense to my heart, and I feel like that's fundamental to who you are as a character. Everything you said today has come from a place of absolute care and love. Which again, as somebody who is in the business of putting words into songs, like I'm not intelligent like you. I have a guttural intelligence. No. Honestly, Bill, I'm just being honest. No. I have a guttural intelligence that's very specific to me, and it's very much my thing, and it allows me a certain way in life. But when I hear somebody like you, I get it. Like I'm in the business of this kind of thinking, of this kind of person, of this kind of individual who is an outsider, like you have described, is not somebody who came with a degree, who's ready to take the 10 skills that they've been outfitted with and then input them into a situation that needs those 10 skills. You were somebody, obviously an outsider, obviously somebody who, where else were we going to get exposed to Bill Richardson? Nowhere. Really. I mean, I wasn't going to, because, I'm not a big reader. I absorb culture and art in my ways, and they're unsophisticated to some degree. And so I get exposure to somebody like you and the dynamism that you contain through that radio show.
You produce a you in your I can say, because I'm 20 years older than you in your short life have produced the most remarkable canon of work. You don't need to, and I know you know this, you don't need to apologize to anybody for anything. I mean, you've been an incredibly successful person, and so why? It's because, I don't know, because you've got the gift, and then all those other intangibles. And I think it's really the intangibles that probably make the difference for a lot of people, because think about piano teachers, for instance. You were talking about Glenn Gould a while ago. I mean, well, Glenn Gould is a special case, obviously, for all kinds of reasons. But there are a lot of people, not a lot, but there are a number of people who of whom one will never ever hear, who can sit down at a piano and play through probably like all the works of Franz Liszt, or name your composer. Mm-hmm. No one is going to pay to hear them do it. Why? When there's people will pay big coin now to hear, name your pianist, Marta Argerich, to do exactly that. And what is the difference? I mean, there's a difference in the talent. So there's some difference in the talent, even if it's just infinitesimal. Mm-hmm. But more than that, I think there's just something that's kind of, I don't know that you can name it. There's something sort of ineffable. It's a quality of character that makes that sort of thing possible. So for someone like you, obviously a very intelligent person, and you gather the stuff in your own way and you put it out, and it resonates with vast numbers of people. So it's a combination of your own musicality and your own literary giftedness, and then whatever else it is, whatever the grain of determination, stubbornness, sure. Ego, all of the things necessarily going to come into play. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah. And you said you weren't analytical, and yet this is what you're talking about. I feel like I pour over this unnecessarily, because one thing I was thinking about you, and we'll come. This will come to a close soon, and then we'll do 15 minutes of special stuff later. But when I was listening to you, and even going through, and there's not a lot of Richardson's Roundup on the internet, I was quite surprised. But the relaxed nature of your voice, we don't know what is happening in people's inner lives, but that voice of yours, and even with the register that you speak, and you and I both have, I would say upper or mid-range speaking voice is not necessarily what you'd consider to be the commanding radio voice,
Well, yet, not Laura Green stuff, yeah.
So your gentleness and the love that was emitted just from the tonality. And again, I love radio for that reason. I love the sound of FM. Even the movement to digital and all of this stuff the romance is disappearing quickly because I like the sound of radio, the very sound of FM with no sound on. Just the sound of silence coming out of radio is very interesting. It's very evocative to me. So, sign me up for anything radio related. But then your voice, the tenderness, and it was so relaxed. It was in a way like it was the voice coming from somebody. And again, I'm just a listener. I'm a fan making an assumption about your inner life, but it's sounded like somebody who has a deep inner confidence. It sounds like somebody who is at rest with themselves. That's what I was hearing.
Oh, well, no, not in any way. Never was, never have been. Okay. And I think this is probably true of, I don't necessarily think most, but of a lot of people who find themselves doing work in whatever the public sphere. Many years ago, I was looking through some family papers and I found my first grade report cards, and they were filled with remarks from my teacher, like Billy needs to learn to have more fun. Billy needs to learn how to relax. Billy is a nervous boy.
Really?
And yeah. And I thought, yep, it was there from the beginning. It was always there. And Mrs. Graham was perceptive enough to see it. Where is she now? Anyway, so no. I mean, if that's how that registers with you, well, that's all to the good. But no, not the case. I'm a massive insecurities, always have been. My life is a disaster. But what can you do? It's also coming to its end. I mean, this is the weird thing about being this age, is that it will make perfect sense for me to drop dead right now. The obituaries are full of people who die at the age of 68. On the other hand, it would also make perfect sense for me to go on for another 30 years. Obituaries are full of people who die at the age of 98. Well, what's it going to be? It makes planning really difficult. I was going to tie this into something beyond the solipsistic observation that I've just delivered. I forget what it was, Hawksley. This is what happens at this age, too. You lose track.
Well, bless you, Bill Richardson. Thank you for being a guest on the Stumble Forward.
Bless you, my son.
We'll call the discussion finished there. But if you would stick around for let's say 10 more minutes for my Patreon folks, and can we discuss opera then we'll leave it at that.
I won't have much to say, but sure, by all means.
Bless you and thank you. Okay, so we're picking up the discussion again with Bill Richardson for the Patreon people, and I want to discuss opera because you had an opera show on the radio. You've had a classical music show on the radio. I grew up with a dad who liked rock and roll. I was a rock and roll kid. I was exposed to very little classical music until in my mid-teens, I went into the old Sam the Record Man on Yonge Street and said, I'm sick of pop music. Give me something that's going to be difficult. The character in the classical music department handed me Charles Ives, and I went home and was very happy with the angularity and absurdity that was presented as soon as I threw that old CD in the player there. I don't know anything about opera. I just know a lot of people, working class people my dad would have gone to work with, hated opera. Last year, I was gifted from my wife tickets to see Adam Egoyan's Salome. This is the first time I've been to opera. I'm outing myself as the rube that I really am. So
that's a great first opera.
Yeah, and it was a stunning work. Like I could tell just from being in the room with that piece of art that it was a very sturdy thing I was seeing. But I saw a lot of stuff, and the mechanics of opera was put in my face. Okay, so also we were just recently in Sicily, and I didn't see an opera, but I saw opera at the Palermo Opera House. So I've seen two now. Okay, but here's what I learned. the reason why people who, my dad's type of people working, like why we don't like opera is it's very difficult and it doesn't meet you halfway. It doesn't get on its knees for you at all. Opera is this opaque thing you have to amble towards yourself. I felt like I had to get on my knees. It wasn't going to come to me. It was a sophisticated thing with a lineage that's gone back hundreds of years or millennia, and that it wasn't going to conform to anything that I could find easy to consume. It was going to be stalwart and steadfast in its own thing. I found that to be fascinating. When I was in Italy watching it, I noticed everybody around me knew how to watch this thing and appreciate it as if they had been taught it in school. And when the diva who sang the thing came back 6-7 times, and each time with a different bouquet, and all the Italians in the audience were crying and weeping and tossing their hats in the air, just as you'd see. It was like something from a film. It was exactly how you would expect Italians to absorb an Italian art form. So I think it's a beautiful thing. And the more I see artists having to conform to what it is society's dictates, and they have to change their language, they have to change their output, they have to, things can't be monetized, so they have to change the way they make their businesses. It's fascinating for somebody like me to wander into an art form that doesn't give a fuck about what I think. It is going to be what it's going to be, and I can either join in its celebration of what it is, or I can find my way to the door. Am I seeing this right?
Well, you're seeing it the way you're seeing it. Yeah, what you're saying makes perfect sense to me. When I started hosting Saturday afternoon at the Opera on, I think at the time it was still called CBC Radio 2, and Radio Music now, or CBC Music. What's it called? I think CBC Music. Anyway, I was I was more than a little nervous about it. I was quite nervous about it because although, I'd grown up as a classical music geek. Okay, so I played. Well, of course, I played the flute. It's always going to be the flute.
Really? And, wow.
Yeah. Well, I was for a long time. I was serious about it. I studied and I learned, the repertoire that everybody learns. And until I was about 19 or so, I thought that was what I was going to do. And finally, I just had to confront the truth of how I was never going to be good enough to really make anything of it. And so I didn't set it aside, but I changed my mind. I moved into other things. I remember this mostly because it was one of those, it was an active decision and an adult decision. It was like, okay, let's be realistic about this. Okay, nobody had to tell me. I just figured it out for myself. And so all through my teenage years, I started when I was 12, when I went to junior high school, which is mostly how, in band, which is mostly how orchestral instruments were picked up in that time. And from that time, from the age of 12 until I was well into my 20s, I listened to no pop music at all. I missed a huge swath of musical history because of kind of, it's probably a sort of snobbishness. And also I just wanted to listen to classical music. So I was that much schooled, and part of that listening had been some opera. I hadn't really made a specialty of it. And there was some I liked and some I didn't like. That was just the way of it. And well, that's probably how it should be. That's just about taste. So I didn't have that kind of connoisseurship that opera lovers, the real dyed-in-the-wool opera lovers have. And I thought, well, maybe that's not necessarily a disadvantage, because if I'm interviewing a singer and she starts talking about, her tessitura or her fach or whatever it is, all that singer vocabulary that comes in, I wouldn't hesitate to say, well, what do you mean by that? And probably there will be listeners who would also benefit from that sort of explanation. But so I heard over the course of those however many years it was that I hosted the show, 4 maybe, I can't remember. I heard a lot of singing, and I talked to a lot of singers, and I learned quite a lot about it. I don't think I deepened my fondness for it any the more. It was sort of my job, and I saw the job more as one of radio presentation than anything else. It is what impresses me about it is, well, it's the singers. That you can open your mouth and make a sung sound that people are happy to hear and want to hear. That impresses the hell out of me. Anybody, if I could pick a gift, it would be that. It would be the gift of singing. I sing like everybody sings, but not in a way that anybody would want to hear. But to be in the presence of opera singers who somehow can haul this thing from their bodies, and they're made exactly like we are, using blood, bone, viscera, but with some crucial difference in the thickness of the chords or in the placement of the cavities here or whatever the resonators are. That all of these things come together. The musicality, the gift for languages, those two things usually go together. The determination, and that they can train themselves to stand on a stage in a huge hall and unamplified, make themselves heard over an orchestra at the back of that hall. That is an extraordinary human thing to do. I will never be able to get over that. And then they just go for a drink afterwards, like anybody else. So it was more than anything, what drew me to it, what draws me to it still, is that when you are hearing that, what we're hearing is a very particular and I think amazing example of just human giftedness. I think of it every time I hear a bird, a songbird that might be in a tree way at the back of the yard or wherever. Teeny tiny bird, little. But from that teeny tiny head, it's making that sound that I can hear all this distance away. And with singers, it's kind of the same thing. It's like they're freaks of nature, and I just love that. And I love with opera itself, with a full production. You go and there's often frankly, I just find it, sometimes I just find it too long. Sometimes I just find it too dull. I understand absolutely why people don't necessarily like it. I don't think it's anything that a lot of people come to naturally. It's probably lives in families, like playing cards.
Yeah, exactly.
Or politics, and if you come to it on its own, then it's as you've done, then it's your own particular path, and it means something different to you for that. Huh. But it is very particular, and it's not necessarily. I totally get why it's not everybody's cup of tea. It's always going to be. I don't want to say connoisseurship because that sounds. That's a cultivated knowledge, and right. You can get as much of that around opera as around watches, or anything else you want to name. Fine silver, whatever it is, it's also such a connoisseurship. But you can also get a lot from it just by dint of base, essentially uneducated fondness, just from the beauty of it. And again, for me, the sense that right, this is another human being. Holy smokes! It's
wonderful how you've crystallized that thought, and it's very true. My mom is now a fine artist, and she's been a fine artist for years and years. She stopped being a hairdresser 25 years ago, and I like buying paintings and I like art, and a lot of it, my appreciation of art in general, is that somebody decided to do that day, like to decide to make something. There's a lot of other things that you could have done to occupy your time.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a miracle in and of itself that somebody would put a brush to a canvas or write music. To to me, this is cumbersome enough activity to warrant that we should just pause and just discuss the fact that somebody just decided to off-road it and make something. Like it's absurd in and of itself, just the act.
Oh no, I absolutely, I could not agree with you more. That this intensely personal human thing that someone has an idea that they executed. My partner is an architect and does a lot of work in creating public art, and I look at the work that he does, and it's just it is astonishing to me that he'll take an idea, something that's just passing through, that's totally ephemeral, and that he has the wherewithal to make it into, I mean, sometimes these quite monumental physical spaces. And God, that happens, you know? It's just so great. I mean, I always think if everybody in the world was like me, we'd be living in nothing but refrigerator cartons. So not even that, because to have a refrigerator carton, you'd have to have a refrigerator, and if the world was like me, none of that would have happened. None of the stuff that I'm surrounded by would have been made. I mean, it does not live anywhere in me to make anything, and I'm so grateful for human variety, and that there are people out there. I mean, what I can bring to the world is so slight and so specific and so really needless, and and that people do understand how to make stuff and build houses and design spray bottles or whatever it happens to be. I should get down on my knees every day and thank God above that this is so. And it's, in fact, it's never far from my mind. I am mindful of it all the time. I'm grateful for it all the time.
Your creative, your image generator. I've delighted in a few of them, and the spray bottle designer. That's another. Again, you've outed yourself a few times as somebody with an inner creative engine that is. It's a 12 cylinder. Again, I'm always interested in so a spray bottle designer. This conversation should be over. An astute podcaster would have said, "Thank you, Bill Richardson. That was wonderful." But I can't. From somebody who is also in the business of generating word ideas, I hear that come out of a mind, and all I need to hear is that to understand what a vast universe lives inside of you. I'll also say this. I've heard it discussed about sophisticated music like jazz and classical being a part of the engine of the architecture that creates a sophisticated inner world and a sophisticated willingness to have sophisticated dialogue with your surroundings, with the people around you. And so I kind of wonder if the young flautist who was skewing towards the want to listen to classical music was in fact sort of laying the foundation for an inner architecture that would have a wonderful dynamism and a depth of understanding and an ideas generator that could come up at 68 years old with a spray bottle designer. Like, maybe I'm listening. Go ahead, Bill.
Hawksley, this is the only reason I said spray bottle.
You don't I get it.
I happen to have one on my table. I
get it, but that's all the magic stuff, Bill. That's the magic stuff. Like, you didn't need to show me that.
Clorox, cleaner and bleach.
I get it. It's sitting there, but your eyes are open, your peripheral is sharp, you're seeing things for what they are, and I'm so grateful for it. Okay, I will leave it there because this has been too circuitous, and Mrs. Graham would love for you to go out and enjoy more of your life, and I'm sure that you'll go out and do that today. And thank you so much for this chat. It's been wonderful. It was, it's everything I was hoping it would be.
My great pleasure. Thank you very much for spending the time.
Okay, Bill, I'm going to let you go.
Okay, Hawksley. Cheers.
Take care.
Bye. Bye.
The The Stumble Forward is an Isadora Media production and is hosted by Hawksley Workman and produced by Jennifer Kavanaugh. Be sure to subscribe and follow The Stumble Forward. You can support the podcast at patreon.com/Hawksley Workman. Thank you for listening.
Stumble forward, stumble forward. The stumble forward, stumble forward, stumble forward, do forward, the stumble.